Hey everyone, welcome to another In Conversation. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. I'm joined by my social media friend of quite some time, Zach Lambert. We've never actually had a conversation, but we're
I
going to get
know.
into it a little bit and talk about his new book, Better Ways to Read the Bible. Zach, thank you so much for joining me. I'm glad we finally get to do this.
I know. Me too. It's so great to see you. And I mean, we're not in person, but we're as close as
Right.
people across the
Yeah.
country can get. So yeah, I'm very grateful for getting to hang out and grateful for you and your voice and your leadership in this
Thank
space and
you.
really appreciate the work you do.
Thank you. Yeah, so there are quite a few things I want to chat with you about because again, we've never actually had a one-on-one conversation, but I'm a fan of your work. I'm a fan of your message. I loved reading your book, and I know a lot of people that follow me know that my journey and my story, I don't come from a deconstruction background. I actually
Yeah.
have always grown up being a progressive and liberal Christian and have always had justice and activism as a part of my faith. And so I didn't have to go through that process, but I'm very,
Yeah.
very empathetic to people that did. But I just want to know a little bit more about your faith journey and how did you end up on this side of Christianity?
Yes. I came to it significantly later than you. I grew up Southern Baptist here in the greater Austin area at a Southern Baptist megachurch. So very kind of white, fundamentalist, evangelical. This was in the late 80s and 90s. So it was kind of at the height of what is called the conservative or the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so our pastor was very involved in that, a very culture warring guy. And so that was kind of what we were raised under, a lot of hellfire and brimstone, but a lot of, we don't like these people and these people are out to get us and all those kinds of things. And so that's the faith I grew up under. I will say, even from an early age, I didn't love it. I was kind of scared by it. I was scared by the picture of God that we were given. And I was kind of bored by it. It just felt like it was, it wasn't compelling. It wasn't beautiful, really, like in any kind of way. And so fast forward, I really didn't become a Christian until probably 17, and even then, it was kind of a radical experience with Jesus, and specifically reading about Jesus in the Gospels and realizing that the childhood churches I grew up in claimed the name of Christ, but talked about the stories of Jesus very little. Talked about
Yeah.
the teachings of Jesus very little. We did a lot of Old Testament stuff. We did a lot of Revelation stuff, a few of Paul's letters, but very little of the Gospels, except maybe Christmas and Easter. Walking on water, feeding the 5,000, but the kind of radical stuff, the revolutionary stuff, we didn't talk about any of that. So like I remember this visceral moment of reading the Sermon on the Mount for the first time and being like, oh my gosh. But it was like immediate, like, why have I never heard this? But then I know why it was never taught in the spaces that I was in. It was
Yeah.
going to be unhelpful to their overall kind of messaging. And so, yeah, that's the kind of spaces I grew up in. I really didn't like at 17 and kind of was trying to figure out what faith looked like at that point, and what it could be, if I was going to do something, uh, and I'd been a part of or what I grew up with. So that led me to kind of exploring broader versions of faith and reading much more widely. And so in my early 20s, came to a place where didn't feel like I was cut out for the Southern Baptist or conservative evangelical world anymore and began to kind of take steps away from that.
Were there any leaders or books that you read that really helped you on your journey of kind of leaving that version of Christianity and
Yeah,
coming to a place where you're like, I really just want to be rooted in Jesus's teachings? Who are you
totally.
following and listening to?
Well, I don't know how common this journey is. So I was in seminary and was really in my early 20s, really like struggling with. I was working at one of the largest churches in America, a huge Southern Baptist church, where the pastor was and is still a faith advisor to Donald Trump, and
Wow.
so that was kind of I was becoming very disillusioned with all of it very quickly. And I remember telling this to a professor, and I went to a very conservative evangelical seminary, and the professor was like, "Hey, come to my office later and let's talk more about it." And so we did. And he kind of flipped me a book like under his desk, was like, "Don't tell anybody I gave this to you." Um, but ironically enough, it was like missional church movement stuff. So it was like Alan Hirsch, Mike Frost, Deb Hirsch, even like Brandon Hatmaker, Hugh Halter, people like that that were doing like, like house church or very just kind of mission oriented church.
Yeah.
And I really began to be compelled by this idea of like, oh, my faith is not just this intellectual assent to a set of doctrines. It's like a living, active thing. And I'm supposed to be involved in my community and I'm supposed to, be a part of building up the spaces that I'm in. And then inevitably, those people referenced like N.T. Wright and Walter Brueggemann and Pete Enns, and then I found Rachel Held Evans, and then I
Yeah.
found liberation theology. Reading everything of like James Cone, Bell Hooks, and all those folks that I could get my hands on.
Yeah.
And so yeah, once I describe it like cracks in a dam. When I started reading much more widely, is when the cracks really started to widen, and then eventually the dam just kind of burst.
What is something that you discovered that shocked you, in regards to, like, when you said you read, Sermon on the Mount, and you weren't really exposed to that in your church?
Yeah,
What is like one of the biggest things that shocked you that you learned when you started doing your own kind of faith journey that you like, well, why weren't we taught this in church? Why was this
yeah,
not the forefront of the conversation? Because I know it's different for so many people, and I
for
know,
sure.
for me, I went to a conservative Christian college, and so
Mm,
that was very different to hear what
yeah.
they were taught versus what I grew up with. So I'm curious what it was like for you. Like, what was that biggest thing that you realized were never taught?
Yeah, there's a very visceral moment I have. I was in college. I think it was my freshman year. I went to a somewhat conservative Christian college, but I went there to play because I was playing football. So I was really, it was kind of incidental to my decision making. But regardless of our major, we had to take one New Testament class and one Old Testament class. I think it was my very first semester. I walk into the first day of New Testament, and our professor, and there was a seminary attached to it that was much more kind of moderate, still Baptist, but much more moderate. And so the professor says, "Hey, I want to, just ask you guys some introductory questions about faith and what you believe." And he said, "I want you to raise your hand if you believe that women are limited in their roles in church or in the home or whatever because of their gender. That our faith or the Bible teaches that." And I'd say like 80% of the room raised their hands, including me. I was just like, yeah, I think that's right. I've never heard anything different than that. And he says, okay, totally understand that. Your homework assignment between now and the next class is to read about these women from the Bible. And he just started like listing all these names for us to read. And so it was like Priscilla and Huldah and Deborah and Mary Magdalene and Junia and all these people. And I was like, I've never even heard of most of these people. And so I go home and I start, or back to my dorm, and I start reading about these women. And oh my gosh, Melinda, I was just like floored by all of these women who were preaching and teaching and leading and judges and outstanding apostles. And I mean, and I was just like, none of these women uh, actually connect with what I've been taught women were like allowed to do. And yet, in the book
Mm,
that they said they're not allowed to do it from, they're doing all these things in the same book. And I was
yeah.
just, and I will say it was one of those moments where you start asking, like, what else have I not been told?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and that leads you down a quick path. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting because for me, and this just goes to show how different our upbringings were. My mom, she was so involved in church. I mean, we had to be at church almost every day, I felt like,
Yeah.
doing some sort of program. But she wrote like this play that we did in church about the women in the Bible. And so I
Wow.
always grew up
Yeah.
knowing all of the women in the Bible. And so I always thought I could do anything because I had
Sure.
these incredible examples. My mom was the one that wrote the play. So it's very interesting to hear that that was such a strong point in people's theology upbringing, that women weren't allowed to lead, they weren't allowed to speak. And I'm glad that people are getting out of that and seeing that women are just as capable of men being able to lead,
Absolutely.
especially from a spiritual place. And speaking on that, I do feel like a lot of people lately are being bolder in their faith because of everything that's happening, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people that specifically have our theological beliefs that are trying to lead with love and lead with more compassion. But do you think there is a unifying message that could bring these different sectors of Christianity together? Or do you think that the theological differences are just too drastic at this point?
Gosh, that's a great question. Um, Well, first, I want to comment really quickly on what you said before, about where how you grew up, and just thanks for sharing that. I mean, I that's how both of my boys are growing up,
I love that.
and it's just, like, so encouraging to, like I hope that the first time my sons hear that women some people believe women aren't allowed to do things is, like, in college,
Yeah.
because they have no concept of that before
Right,
that. So,
right,
anyway, thank
right.
you for that.
Of
It's
course.
very, very encouraging.
Oh, good.
Yeah, to your question about the divide, I think I think there's too big of a theological goal for there to be kind of a singular cut across message.
Mm,
Um, and I don't think that this is recent either. I think that it's been this way for a pretty long time. I'm reading a book right now called "The Bible Told Them So," and it's about how have you heard of that?
no, I
It's
haven't.
like
Who's
about
that by?
it's really good. It's about how it's by a historian Hawkins, I believe is his name, and it's about how white Christians, specifically in the South, fought against integration and fought for segregation. And he talks at length about this meeting that JFK had when he was going to unveil the new legislation he was trying to push through about equal rights and civil rights and all that stuff. And so JFK is trying to, build consensus around this, build support for it. And so he calls in all these different groups, and one of them is a group of clergy,
Mm,
and the vast majority of the clergy that he calls in are like from northern large cities, DC, New York, that kind of stuff. And they're mostly mainline progressives. And so, but then he ends up inviting a couple of like white Southern kind of, conservative evangelical folks. And so he lays out this meeting of like, hey, here's the Civil Rights Act. Here's what we want to happen. And, he's like, what do y'all think? And, it's pastor after pastor being like, yes, Kennedy, like, this is amazing. We're so excited. This is a moral issue. This is a Christian issue.
yeah.
And like they recorded one guy that basically said like, yeah, this has legal implications and financial implications and blah, blah, blah. But at the core for me, and I think everybody else in here, this is a spiritual issue. Like more
Mm,
than anything else, that's the most important part of it. And so, like Kennedy's feeling good. He's like, this is going well. And then this white pastor from Florida raises his hand and says, I feel every bit as strongly about how my Christian faith informs my entire life and especially this issue, but I believe that it should lead us towards segregation and continuing segregation. And he had all
interesting.
these Bible verses ready and all this stuff.
Mm,
And that was just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it was, integration was primarily fought by, especially in the South, white Christians,
sure, sure.
and these were things that local churches were like passing resolutions to not support the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all that stuff. So anyway, I give that as an example from what the '60s, right?
Yeah, right.
I think that the issue is not like that we haven't figured out, I think, what the common ground is. I think the issue is that we have for so long pretended that these two disparate forms of Christianity actually have a lot in common,
Mm,
because they just really don't.
yeah,
And
yeah.
if they can lead you in different ways on fundamental issues like human rights, equality of all people, flourishing of all people, then I'm not sure that there's just like a hey, here's a 10-minute gospel message that brings us back
It brings
from
us
that.
right, right, right. Yeah,
What do you think? What have you seen?
gosh, I've seen a lot. I don't even know where to begin. Well, it's so interesting to me because you would think that the unifying message would just be what Jesus said
Right.
because we're Christians, right?
Absolutely.
But then you look at how many different denominations there are, and within those denominations, they all have different interpretations of what type of Christian you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to believe. So I don't want to be a pessimist, but even just looking at it from that lens, it's hard to figure out what a unifying message would be for Christians
Absolutely.
overall. Um, you would think that love would bring us together. You would think that helping people would bring us together, and that just trying to emulate how Jesus walked the earth would bring us together, but it's not because there's different interpretations on even what it means to be a Christ follower.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't even have an answer to that question. That's what I'm asking a pastor. Um, So I don't know. We'll see. But I do appreciate that more people are being bolder in their faith,
Yeah,
trying to counter a lot of these negative narratives and this bad theology that is very
same.
harmful that we're seeing. Because I don't think we've had a lot of people be as loud as the opposition. And
Absolutely.
so I think that we're in a time and place when it's needed. So
I agree.
people need to not be afraid to speak out. And I do not fault people for not wanting to wear the label of Christian
Sure.
anymore.
Sure.
But I'm stubborn and I'm not going to let them take it
That's
from
right.
me.
That's
And
right. They
so
can't have it.
I don't want to let them have it. So I'm gonna keep fighting to be that person that is about the love and compassion and justice and
I love that.
inclusivity. Yeah. Let's talk about your book a little bit.
All right.
Thank you so much for writing it. First of all, I really enjoyed reading it, and also reading it from the lens of my upbringing, which was
Yeah.
very different. Right?
Yeah.
You dropped a lot of nuggets of wisdom, and what I always like to ask people that have written books is, "What is your favorite chapter?" Because I think going through the process of writing, you not only are sharing your wisdom with other people, but I think you probably learn a lot about yourself as well, and kind of have to go back into that vault to be
Totally.
able to share it. So, what was your favorite chapter to write? And did you learn anything about yourself in the process of writing it?
Yes, great question. And thanks for saying that about the book. It was a blast to write. And what you said earlier about, you're not going to let them take Christian from you. That's how I feel about the Bible too. Like I'm not going
Yeah.
to let them take the Bible. And that's why I wrote the book, to say that there are other ways, and might I say better ways than a lot of the ways that we've been given. I would say that my favorite chapter, favorite is, a loose term in the sense that, I'm not sure it's one that I like want to go back to and read all the time, because it's kind of a hard one.
Yeah.
But it's the hierarchy lens chapter, which is one of
Mhm.
the four harmful lenses.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
reason I would say it's my favorite is I just think it's the most important right now. Um,
Yes.
when I started writing this book a couple of years ago, I had no idea how prevalent it would be, like, right, in this moment right now.
Like truly.
Like, truly, I
So
mean,
relevant. Yeah.
it's unbelievable the way we're seeing the Bible used,
Mhm.
specifically by the at the highest levels of this current administration. We've got Department of Homeland Security videos with verses from Isaiah over the top of them. Here I am, send me, and then it's ICE agents, hurting immigrants, or
Yeah.
whether it, like, Charlie Cook's memorial. I mean, there's just so many things that, like, you know anyway, it's so tragically prevalent. And the hierarchy lens, specifically, in a word or two, is that the Bible tells us who is in charge of who else, who is more important than others. And this is usually done based on race, gender, sexual orientation, age, ability level, those kinds of things. And so this was the lens of Nazi Germany, that felt like certain brands of German Lutherans were higher above Jews and really everybody. It's the lens of chattel slavery and the African slave trade, right? And that was
Yeah.
given papal endorsement under this lens of, like, well, we are more important than Africans and value more, we're more valuable to God, and that's horrific theology. And it was, again, the same one for the Native American displacement and genocide that happened in this country, by the colonizers. But it's also the lens that we're seeing, like, literally in front of us all the time right now,
Right.
like the
Right.
Department of Homeland Security videos, like, the use of Bible verses to try to get the 19th Amendment repealed so women can't vote. There are 88 anti-LGBTQ plus bills in our state Congress right now. Like, and they're almost like, I mean, a bunch of them mention Bible verses that I've
Yeah.
read. A bunch of them
Yeah.
mention Bible verses. And so the way that we're seeing this, not just in churches, but in the public square, is terrifying. And so I hope that that lens helps give people a way of understanding just how harmful this is, and that it's really not a good way of reading the Bible, not just because it has
Yeah.
terrible outcomes, but because it's really not at all faithful to the story, which is one of
Yeah.
equity and flourishing and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah. Just answering this question for people that have just popped on. We're talking about his new book, Better Ways to Read the Bible. Zach Lambert is fan fantastic. And it's also what I also appreciated about it is that it's very accessible and it meets the person where they're at
Totally.
because the Bible is a very heavy, contradictory, confusing sometimes
Yeah.
book, but I do think that there's so much beauty in it and there's a lot of guidance and I love that you show all aspects of it. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask you maybe for someone that has deconstructed, is trying to reconstruct it, maybe hasn't opened their Bible in a long time, wants to, hasn't been to church in a long time, wants to, just anybody's that's at that point in their journey,
Yeah.
how do you recommend just kind of restarting again? Because
Totally.
it is difficult. I get
Yeah.
that. And again, even as someone who hasn't gone through that, I've had moments of faith crisis and wondering,
100%.
look around the world, like, how can you not question, like, God, where are you? What is
Yeah.
happening? So,
Absolutely.
what is your advice for people that might be in
Yeah.
that phase of their journey?
Well, I would say, I mean, that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
You know, if you're listening and that's you, you're who I wrote this book for. I hope it helps tons of other people, you know, that are curious, that are, you know, maybe they're conservatives and trying to understand somebody else's perspective. I hope that it helps all those people. But the real, like, deep reason, the primary person I wrote it for, is the person who has experienced the weaponization of the Bible against them or against people that they
Mhm.
love, and it's caused them to either walk away completely or, you know, check out halfway, or like whatever it is, it's caused you tremendous pain and harm. And my hope is that the book can be a part of that healing journey. And you know, it's that, honestly, that's been my very favorite part. The book's been out like 6 weeks. That's been my very favorite part, is getting to hear stories from people who, you know, I last week, a guy in my church came up to me and said, you know, my we came out of evangelicalism. We were super intense, you know, quiet times every day, family quiet time every day. And my oldest son, who's now in high school, you know, he was always leading it. And but then when we deconstructed and left, and he had the Bible weaponized against him and some of his friends in some really terrible ways. And he just said it's been like 4 years and the kid hadn't picked up a Bible when he used to, you know, live for reading it every day. And he said, but he heard about your book and he bought it unbeknownst to us. And he read the whole thing and he
Mhm.
walked in and he had your book in one hand and the Bible in the other hand. And he said, I think I'm going to try to read the Bible again. And I'm
Wow.
just like crying, you know, in the
I know.
lobby
I
of
was like, that
church.
made me emotional. I got teary eyed as you saying that.
And gosh, like, you know, I know it sounds cheesy, but like that person is enough. Like, you know,
No.
if nobody
Yeah.
else ever even read the book, but that's who I wrote it for, and that's my hope for people, is that people would be able to, yeah, find some healing, and that they would also hear somebody say, a pastor say, like, I'm sorry that happened to you, and it wasn't okay, and it wasn't what Jesus wanted, and it was never how God intended for Scripture to be used, and that there is a better way. There's a
Mhm.
healthier way to engage, and when you get to that place where you're ready to try it, I hope the book and anything else that we put out is helpful.
I love that. Zach, thank you so much. I will definitely link your book in the notes when we publish this. I appreciate this conversation. I'm glad we finally got to do it.
I know, me too.
Long time coming. Other than your Substack, where else can people follow you?
Um, yeah, I'm on all the socials. Mostly probably Instagram and Twitter are my two favorites. I won't call it X. Instagram and Twitter are my two favorites. Um, but yeah, I have open DMs on purpose, which causes me to get a lot of terrible things. But the reason I have that is because if you're one of those folks that we were just talking about, or you're someone with a question, like, I try to never leave a DM unread. I want to make sure that people feel like they can be heard, and all that kind of stuff. So if you need that, you need some prayer. Actually, that's one of my favorite things. People will DM me and ask for just prayer about something, and I'll usually voice DM back a prayer, you know, and it's amazing how many people have told me, you know, I haven't had a pastor pray for me in 10 years or 15 years or whatever, because, you know, I'm gay or because I left the church or
Mm.
whatever. And so, yeah, those are my favorite things to do. So if I can ever do anything to support any of y'all listening, please don't hesitate to reach out. And Malynda, thanks so much for having me on. It's a joy to connect. I've followed you for a long time, learned a ton from you, and I'm so excited that you continue to step into more and more influence, because you're a voice that we really, really need in this moment.
Thank you. Well, ditto, friend. Ditto. You lead with intention, and I am so grateful for you. Thanks for joining me. And thanks for tuning in, everyone. Until next time.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.